Today's daf is daf Yud Zayin. Just want to reiterate that daf Tes Zayin, which was yesterday's daf, is already up online. And we're up to Tanur Rabbanan, which is the second line from the top. And this Beitza is going to record a machlokes about tefillah, about davening, when you have an overlap of two kedushos. So the first case of the Beitza is Yontif Shechalios B'Shabbos. You have Yontif on Shabbos, very frequent. And the question is, the tefillah is essentially a Shabbos tefillah. And no doubt about it, the essence of the tefillah, which means the fourth or the middle bracha of the seven brachos, which is called Kedushas Hayom, is certainly dedicated to Shabbos. But the question is, it also happens to be Yontif. So where are we going to fit Yontif into the tefillah? So Beit Shammai, Omri Mispalel Shmona. We cannot disturb a bracha that is dedicated to Shabbos by interjecting or integrating Yontif into that bracha. That bracha must remain purely for Shabbos. And it will open with the words, Asher Kidshanu B'Mitzvosav, and he gave us I'll read to you the nusach here. Batite Lanu Es Yom HaShabbos Hazeh, Yom HaMenucha Hazeh. Again, there are different texts. So that's absolutely clear. But on the other hand, it's Yontif. We have a principle of Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. B'chol Yom V'Yom Pein Lo Mein Berchosav. We need to mention a special day in Tefillah. So Beit Shammai says we have no choice here. We're going to have to jack up the number of brachos of any Shmona Esrei during the course of Shabbos, overlapping Yontif Yom V'Yom Shabbos, and jack it from 7 brachos to 8 brachos, because we're going to need a special bracha for Yontif. And therefore, Mispal Shmona, the Omer. So now he has to set up 2 brachos, both of which are part of Kedushas Hayom, and both of which cover the basis for Shabbos and Yontif. Shel Shabbos b'fnei atzma, shel Yontif b'fnei atzma. And therefore we cannot integrate. Beis Hillel is anti-integration. He's the segregation shita. Whereas Beis Hillel Omrim, Mispal Sheva. We always maintain that secret number, that magic number of 7 brachos, and we're going to integrate both Yontif and Shabbos into one bracha, into that middle bracha, we call it bracha number 4. Maschil b'Shabbos, even Beis Hillel agrees that Shabbos is the main character or essence of the tefillah. So we begin with Shabbos, and as we said before, God, you have chosen us, Vatitei Lanu Es Yom HaShabbos Hazeh, or Yom HaMenucha Hazeh, different kirsos. And now, in order to integrate, we're going to add the Es Yom Chag HaSukkos Hazeh, Yom Chag HaMatzos Hazeh. U'Mesayim B'Shel Shabbos. The Omer Kedushas Hayom Ba'emtza. In other words, according to Beis Hillel, since the mainstay of this bracha, what we call the primary Ikar HaBracha, is Shabbos, therefore the Chasima has to reflect the main motif of the bracha, which is Shabbos, and therefore Baruch Atah Hashem HaKadosh HaShabbos. However, in the main body of the bracha, we're going to integrate Yontif together with Shabbos. So we'll have Vatitei Lanu Es Yom HaShabbos Hazeh, Ves Yom Chag, whatever the Chag is, Hazeh. So in a sense, Beis Hillel is opposed to segregation, and he's in favor of integration, but not total integration. Only integration in the Guf HaBracha, but not in the Chasimas HaBracha. The Chasimas HaBracha always has to be monolithic. There's only one theme allowed to the Chasima. You can't have a Chasimas HaBracha that partners up with two and reflects two different themes, two different motifs, both Yontif and Shabbos. Then we get to the total integration shita, which is the third Tana, and that's Rebbe. Rebbe Omer, Af Chosem Ba, Mekadesh HaShabbos, the Yisrael Vazmanin. Meaning that even in the Chasima, we will push for integration. And apparently Rebbe holds that when you have an overlap of 2 days of Kedushas Hayom that overlap in one 24-hour period, then the two Kedushos somehow merge into one. So whereas Beis Hillel still maintain that Yontif is one Kedusha, Shabbos is another distinct Kedusha, and each one deserves its own mention in the Bracha Emtsois, but the Chasima could not possibly reflect both days, both Kedushas. Whereas Rebbe goes a step further, he integrates even the Kedusha for the Chasima, and therefore Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbos, the Yisrael Vazman. Tani Tana Kami Ravina, there was one of the Chachamim who presented a Beitza to Ravina. And Ravina is going to point out that you cannot take this Beitza literally. The Beitza says, in the name of Rebbe, that the Chasima should be Mekadesh Yisrael, put the word Yisrael at the beginning of the Chasima, V'Shabbos Vazman. So the word Shabbos in this Girsa is going to follow the word Yisrael. Amalei Ravina says, no. I object. Atu Shabbos Yisrael Mekadshele. When you put the word Yisrael before the word Shabbos, you're implying that it's only because of Knesset Yisrael and their sanctity that Shabbos is sanctified. That's not true. Shabbos Mekadsha V'kaima. The sanctity of Shabbos is not at all dependent upon Klal Yisrael. We don't need to be Mekadesh the Shabbos. The Shabbos is Kviya V'kaima. It has its own self-generated Kedusha, and therefore to put the word Yisrael before the word Shabbos is a mistake. Ella Ema, but rather you should change the Girsa, and it should say Mekadesh HaShabbos. God, you have sanctified the Shabbos, the Yisrael, and you've sanctified Klal Yisrael with the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim and Vazmanim. And now that Klal Yisrael is endowed with Kedusha, they could sanctify the Zmanim. Rav Yosef Halacha Kerebi Kiditaritz Ravina. We accept Ravina's amendation of the Beitza. We accept Rebbe's Shita, total integration. We will integrate Yontif not only in the Gufa Bracha, as Beis Hillel would have it, but also in the Chasimas HaBracha. But we have to be careful that we shouldn't put the word Yisrael before Shabbos, but rather it should be wedged in between Yisrael and Azman. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Beitza. Now we're going on to discuss another overlap of two Kedushos, not Yontif and Shabbos, but Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos, or Chol HaMoed and Shabbos. So once again, we face the same problem. We must mention Rosh Chodesh in our davening because of the principle of Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. We must mention Chol HaMoed, the Kedushas Hazman of Chol HaMoed in the Tefillah. And the Beitza records many different shitos, views as to how to formulate the Tefillah. The first view, we'll call it the Tanakama, says that Shabbos Shechal Lios B'Rosh Chodesh O B'Chol Shel Moed Arvis V'Shachris U'Mincha. We're not talking about Musaf. We're going to have a separate section in the Beitza dedicated to Musaf. Mispalel Sheva. After all, it's Shabbos. Shabbos gets 7 brachos. And now we want to maintain that number 7. So where are we going to mention Rosh Chodesh or Chol HaMoed? The Omer Me'ein HaMa'ora. He should mention Rosh Chodesh or Moed in what we call Yalev v'yovo. Yalev v'yovo is an added paragraph to fulfill the Baruch Hashem Yom Yom, meaning the Me'ein HaMa'ora. But now the Beitza records two opinions. Where exactly should Yalev v'yovo be integrated? Again, we're very familiar with the first opinion because we pass like Tanna Kamma. Be'avoda. Avoda, as you know, is the bracha called Ritzeh. And since we're asking for the special karbanos and the special avoda in the Mikdash of Rosh Chodesh or Chol Moed, therefore, once we get to avoda, to Ritzeh, we are obligated to mention Rosh Chodesh or Chol Moed. V'im lo Amar, and this obligation is so powerful, machzirin also. If he omitted Yalev v'yovo, then he has to repeat Shmon Esrei. Now, whether this is true for women or only for men is a gigantic issue. Another great issue is, what about Ma'ariv? It could be that, at least as far as Rosh Chodesh is concerned, if you left out Yalev v'yovo at night, you would not repeat Shmon Esrei. But this Beitza gives you the impression that there's no difference between Ma'ariv, Shachris, Mincha. If you left out Yalev v'yovo, you did not fulfill your chiyuv of giving due notice and thanks to Hashem and gratitude for Rosh Chodesh Chol Moed. You have to repeat Shmon Esrei. Now, you and I might have said, well, why don't we just give him a text of Yalev v'yovo, let him read it? No. It's got to be integrated into the fabric of Shmon Esrei. It's a chiyuv to be mazkir the day in the framework of Shmon Esrei. If you didn't do so, you'll repeat the Shmon Esrei. Now, I don't know what the status of the first Shmon Esrei is. The impression you get is that it's worthless, but I'm not sure. It could be, again, you'd have to really delve into the laws of tefillah, that the first tefillah is also meaningful, but it's missing one element, and that element requires you to set the second tefillah. But both tefillahs together are valid. That's the sheet of the Tanna Kamma, and the appropriate place to insert Yalev v'yovo is the Avoda Ritzeh. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. Omer Bahudah. He says that you should recite it in the bracha of Modim, which is the very next bracha after Avoda. And Rashi offers an explanation for this. If you find it, you're in great shape. It's about 15, 20 lines down from the top. Dibra Maskel Bahudah. Rashi says, K'mosha Omer ala nisim b'Chanukah uPurim. So it comes out very interesting. According to Rashi's understanding of Rabbi Eliezer, the paradigm for Me'ein HaMa'ora in a case of something that is a special day, but it doesn't have a full-fledged Kedushas Hayom. You drop down one level. For example, Chol Moed doesn't have a full-blasted Kedushas Hayom. Certainly Rosh Chodesh does not. And Chanukah and Purim have no Kedushas Hayom. But Chanukah and Purim now become a tool in the hands of Rabbi Eliezer to determine where Yalev v'yovo should be placed, or for that matter, any hodah to thank Hashem for a special day, where should that be inserted in tefillah? And we're going to derive this from Purim and Chanukah. Where do we recite Ala Nisim? Of course, in Odah. So whereas the Tanna Kamma sees Yalev v'yovo on Rosh Chodesh and Chol Moed as essentially avod badik, meaning it reflects on the chiyuv of karbanos, Rabbi Eliezer, for his part, sees that the essence of Me'ein Ma'ora in Rosh Chodesh and Chol Moed is hodah, to thank Hashem and express our gratitude for having granted us these special days. So Rosh Chodesh and Chol Moed require Me'ein Ma'ora b'toras Yom Miyuchad, not Yom Kadosh, because if you're going to mention Yom Kadosh, then you go back to the Tanna Kamma, but Yom Miyuchad, a special day with its own mitzvahs. Of course, you wonder, what would Rabbi Eliezer say if a person omitted Yalev v'yovo Rosh Chodesh, or for that matter on Chol Moed? It's possible that he need not recite a second Shmon Esrei. He could be Yotzei with the first Shmon Esrei, just like in Chanukah and Purim, the rule is that if you omitted Al Nisim, then you don't repeat Shmona Esrei. Now the Beitza continues to address the Tefillah of Musaf. We left out the Tefillah of Musaf, and we're talking about an overlap between Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, or between Shabbos and Chol Hamoed. And once again, the Beitza records a machlokas. The Tanna Kama says, "Ubemusafin maskil b'shel Shabbos, umesayim b'shel Shabbos," which makes absolutely sense because this is a musaf of Shabbos. We cannot, Shabbos is the primary kedusha, and it deserves a tefillah of musaf for the special carbon of Shabbos. But the Omer kedusha sayom b'emtza. Here, this opinion reflects Beis Hillel and Rebbe in the previous Beitza, namely that the kedusha sayom deserves, at the very minimum, that we integrate that kedusha sayom together with that of Shabbos in the guf habrach. But Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Rabbi Shmuel, Benosha, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka omrim, kol makom shehuzkak l'sheva. Whenever we recite 7 brachos, for example, the Tefillah of Shabbos, and this applies to Arvis, to Shachris, to Mincha, is maskil b'shel Shabbos, u'mesayim b'shel Shabbos, v'omer kedusha sayom be'emtza. In other words, according to these Tanoim, when it comes to Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed, we should not push them aside if they overlap with Shabbos. Once we're adding and integrating a Kedusha Sayom of Shabbos, then we should go one step further and introduce the Kedusha Sayom of Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed. So don't wait for Avoda to recite Yalav V'Yovo. Just mention these days as an integration into the Guf HaBracha, the middle bracha, the fourth bracha. And certainly, this last Shita will argue with Beit Shammai, because Beit Shammai was in favor of segregation. Amar Avuna, ein halacha koso azug. We're not going to accept la halacha, the Shita of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel, but rather we're going to accept the Shita of the Tanna Kama that we mentioned on the top, the first Beitza, that in Arvis, Shachris, U'Mincha Shabbos, we mention the Yalav V'Yovo, the Meina Ma'ora, in Avoda, in Ritzei, not in Modin. Amar Rab Chia bar Ashi, Amar Rav. Now we're talking about Yontif Sheni Shel Golios. Meniach Adam Erev Tchumim Miyontov L'Chavero Umasne. The emphasis here is on the word Umasne, which means that when you put down a loaf of bread as an Erev Tchumen, which will allow you to walk more than 2,000 amma outside the city limits. In other words, if you on let's say classic on Erev Yontif, or for that matter, Erev Shabbos, you know that you're going to have to walk 4,000 amos from your house, 2,000 amos beyond the city, and another 2,000 amos to get to the next city. So you put down a pas, a loaf of bread there, and you kona shvisa there. So you have to go out there. There may be another way of doing it, but halicha baragla. But in any event, that's where you're going to put the Erev. He forgot to do the Erev on Erev Yontif. And Reb Chia, in the name of Rav, says that he can do the Erev on Yontif. And he makes it tonight. He makes the following stipulation. If today is Chol, we don't know, it's in Golio, so we didn't get the word as to when the previous month was Mole or Chos. If today is Chol, which means that it's a Mole, then fine. It's Erev Yontif, I'm putting down an Erev Tchumen. If on the other hand, today is Yontif, which means that the previous month was Chaser, then tomorrow's Chol, and therefore my Erev today will be totally invalid. I don't want to make an Erev on Yontif, that you're not allowed to do, but I will again repeat the Erev tomorrow on the second day of Yontif Sheni Shel Golis. So again, he wouldn't be allowed to go Chutz L'Tchum on the first day of Yontif Sheni, but on the second day, he'd be allowed to go Chutz L'Tchum. Omar Rava says, what's the din in such a case regarding Erev Tavshilin? Meiniach Adam Erev Tavshilin Yontif L'Chavero Umasna. And Rava says, how much more so should we be allowing him to make this Tanai for Yontif Rich on Yontif Sheni, Shel Golios, in the case of Erev Tavshilin? So he sets aside an Erev Tavshilin on the first day of Yontif because he forgot to do it on Erev Yontif. And he says, if today is Yontif, then this is not going to be an Erev Tchum, Erev Tavshilin. If it is, let it be an Erev Tavshilin. If it's Yontif today, then tomorrow's Chol, because of the principle called Sfeik Biyoma. And therefore tomorrow, I'm going to set up another Erev Tavshilin so I can cook tomorrow, the second day of Yontif, for Shabbos. The Gemara analyzes this. Man Diyoma Rav, who started by saying Erev Tchumin, Kol Shkein, how much more so it goes without saying Erev Tavshilin. You could certainly use the Tanai for an Erev Tavshilin. Uman Diyoma, according to Rava, Erev Tavshilin, only in the case of Erev Tavshilin did Rava rule leniently, lahatir, that we can do the Erev Tavshilin on the first day of Yontif, then repeat it on the second day of Yontif. Aval Erev Tchumin, lo. He would not allow for Rav's Tanai of Erev Tchumin. Why not? My taima dilemikni shvisa b'shabasa. Lo. In order to set up an Erev Tchumin, you need to be konesh shvisa. Means you actually acquire a, so to speak, again, it's only a halachic acquisition for the sake of Erev Tchumin. But nevertheless, it is a kinyan, and you konesh shvisa. Shvisa means that's where I am allowing or accepting the Shabbos. We don't do that on Yontif. To be konesh shvitz on Yontif, we're not allowed to do. And we're allowing Erev Tavshilin, the Tanai, even according to Rava. And the leniency for Erev Tavshilin, as opposed to Erev Tchumin, is explained by Rashi as Lekovit Shabbos. This is the Rashi Dibra Maskil Delimikne Shvisa, towards the end of the Amud, about 15 lines up before the end of the Amud. Rashi says that Lo Itiru Lo Liknos Shvisa B'Yontiv Afilu Misafek Hitiru Emitiru Be'erev Tavshilin Hasa Mishum Kvod Shabbos Itiru. So Rashi says there was a special leniency in the case of Erev Tavshilin for covered Shabbos in order to make sure that he could prepare the food for Shabbos. The simple explanation of this Gemara, and everyone and their uncles wondering why Rashi had to complicate matters, is that the reason why we're making on Erev Tavshilin is because there's no kinyan. And some want to explain that Rashi holds that Erev Tchumin has another problem, not a kinyan problem, but what's called mirakim misaken, meaning by changing the status as far as cooking on Yontif for Shabbos, there's a tikkun, and anything that involves a tikkun is prohibited on Yontif. Like we said, Tevilas Kalim, to be Makbil Kalim, and change the status from Tomei to Tar is prohibited on Yontif. And therefore, even in Erev Tavshilin, no less than Erev Tchumin, we're being matir through a tikkun, and that's also on Yontif. So Rashi has to introduce covered Shabbos. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Brayso saying, "Ofim Yontif l'chavero." in the case of Yontif Sheni Shel Golios, you cannot cook or bake on the first day of Yontif for the second day of Yontif. The MS Amru, however, they said, this is a statement of the Chachamim, that what happens in a case where he desperately needs to bake on the first day of Yontif for the second day of Yontif, there is a solution to the problem. Mala Isha Kol Hakdera Basar Afal Pichen Etricha El Chaticha Achas. Now, my friends, this is a principle which we should write on the whiteboard, which is called Ribui Shiurim. Ribui Shiurim, which means that once you're already turning on the fire, we could allow you to keep in the pot even that which you're not going to need. Why? Because there's no extra tircha. When you are baking on the first day of Yontif for the second day of Yontif, that's a tircha, which is prohibited from one day for the sake of the next. But if with one baking, or one, in this case, cooking, all you do is just turn on the oven, turn on the fire, then there's no extra tircha. That's called ribu shiurim, and that's mut. So imagine a case where you won't be able to prepare your meat for the second day of Yontif. What you do is you add extra meat into the pot on the first day of Yontif and then turn on the fire. Again, keep in mind, if you've already turned on the fire and now you want to add extra meat, that's for sure prohibited, because then you're doing a separate bichul for the sake of tomorrow. Now, the same principle applies with regard to baking. Mimale nachtum chavish al mayim. A nachtum is an ofen, not necessarily a professional ofen. You know, if you bake, you're considered a nachtum. And you need water. You have to heat up the water so that you're allowed to do. It's yontif. And now, memale nachtom chavish al mayim. He only needs a certain amount of water. He's allowed to fill up all the way to the top, and then heat up the water. Afal pishen utzarch el keton. Echad, all he needs is one vessel worth, and it's all again tircha achas. Avalefos, which means that every time you put in a dough into the oven, you're doing a separate maisa, a separate tircha, is eno ofer ela mashet tzarich lo. You're only allowed to bake that amount of loaves of bread that you'll need for Yontif. But according to this view, the Tanakam of this brisa, you're not allowed to put more dough into the oven than you need. Rab Shimon Elazar omer memala isha kol hatanur pas. He's going to allow you to fill up the entire oven with one pas after the other, even though he knows he only needs a very limited amount. Pas nefes yafa bizman shatanur mole. In the old days, they used to have what's called a tanur katan, a very small oven. And they would have to put the dough against, all the walls of the oven, this very small oven. And when it's filled, then kishu mole mitzamtem chalolo v'ein lachom makom lispashet. When the small oven is full of breads, of doughs, there's no room for extra heat. Everything is condensed and trapped in a very small area. However, if he has a larger oven and there's plenty of room for the heat to circulate throughout the oven, then on the contrary, the more loaves of bread that he bakes simultaneously in the oven, the better it is. Hamilui gorem shapas te'ofer heitev. The fact that you fill up the oven is going to improve the baking process, and therefore it's considered litzorech yontif. So the basic rule here is that in cooking or heating up water and the like, you can add and then turn on the fire. Ribu shiurim, it's mutter, and that's fine. And that's going to be a solution for cooking from one day of Yontif to the other, an event that he did not. I'm sorry. Now, however, in the case of baking, it's more complicated. And the Tanakhama maintains that you can't add to the baking of more breads than you're going to eat on Yontif, because then you're clearly baking from one day to the next. However, according to the opinion of Shimon Elazar, there's no problem, because the more bread you put in the oven, the better the process of baking, and so forth. Amar Rav Halacha ki Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So he's paskening l'kula. Now the big problem here with this sugya is that there are two parts to meleches hafir. One is putting the dough into the oven, and the other is what's called ridias hapas, to take the bread out of the oven. If you've ever gone to a pizza shop where they make it on the spot, like on Derech Chevron, there's a place called Agvania. It's a whole different type of pizza. It's like the European pizza. So you can see the way they bake pizza, but you'll notice that taking the pizza out of the oven is not so simple. It's called ridias hapas. And now, if he fills up his oven and he doesn't need that much, then when he takes the bread out, he's going to have to take one loaf out at a time. That's an extra tircha. Why is that mutter? And the Rishonim apply here a principle which we had earlier in the Masechta, which is called hitiru sofan mishum tchilasan. Since they wanted to encourage a person to bake for Yontif and make it easier for them, they went ahead and they were lenient beyond the scope in order to allow the sof, because otherwise they're not going to do the tchila. I'm not going to put loaves of bread in the oven if I'm not going to be able to take it out of the oven. Iboilu, the Gemara has the following suffix. Mishalo hiniach eruve tafshilin. A person did not set up an eruv tafshilin. Who Nesar? Certainly he's not allowed to bake from Yontif to Shabbos. But what about his kemach? What's the status of his dough? Can somebody else use his dough, add water and bake it for Shabbos? Hu Nesar v'gam kimcho Nesar, o dilma hu Nesar v'yein kimcho Nesar. There's no Iser here in the Chefetz itself. Now the first side says, no, we're gonna impose a penalty, because since you didn't make an Erev Tavshilin, not only are you enjoined from doing these malachas on Yontif for the purpose of Shabbos, but we're going to impact and change the status of your kemach, so that your kemach is now outside the purview of the Erev Tavshilin. I mean, what difference to make whether or not you impose an Iser on the kemach? He's not allowed to bake. But the answer is that if there's no Iser that spreads and encompasses even the kemach, then he could be makna. He can transfer ownership over the kemach to his friend who has an Erev Tavshilin, and his friend could bake the bread for him. If there's an Isa on the kemach, it's because he owns the kemach, and we're penalizing him. Now he's got to get someone else to sit in the driver's seat, so to speak, and hold the reins and acquire ownership on the kemach. Somebody else who has an eruv. But Iamrid hu nesar v'ein kimcho nesar lo tzarich laknuye kimcho lacherim. He can give his kemach to the acherim and let them bake for him, or he can invite them in to bake in his own oven, and using his own kemach. There's no need to be machne the kemach. And Rabbosai, we're explaining this Gemara according to Rashi. Tosfos is a much more complicated chat. In any event, Toshma, we're going to answer this suffix from a Beitza. Mishalo iniach eruvei tavshilin areza lo yofev lo yevashel lo yatmin. He's enjoined from baking, cooking, and even doing hatmana. Hatmana means that they used to heat up food by submerging it, into the chol, into the sand. Lo v'lo acherim. He cannot bake neither for himself nor for others. V'lo acherim ofim umevashlim lo. And no one else is allowed to bake and cook on his behalf for Shabbos. So the Beitza asks the question, how do we solve this problem? The man needs to prepare for Shabbos, covered Shabbos. And the Beitza answers, Makne kimcho lacherim. V'heim ofim lo umevashlim lo. Shma mino hu nesar kimcho nesar. That even his kemach is asur as long as he retains ownership on it. Therefore, he has to transfer ownership over to someone else. Iboilu, another suffix in the Gemara, is avar v'afa mai. He didn't leave an erev tafshilin from Yontif to Shabbos, meaning from erev Yontif, and then he went ahead and he baked on Yontif for Shabbos. Should we penalize him and prohibit the baking? Is he allowed on Shabbos to use that loaf of bread that he baked on Yontif without an eruv for his lechem mishnah? Toshma will try to answer this question from a Beitza. Mishalo iniach eruve tavshilin keitzeru oseh makne kimcho lacherim v'acherim ofen lo umevashlim lo. So this we saw already, that he can transfer ownership to his friend over the kemach, and his friend is allowed to bake on his behalf.